Today, we will learn and reflect on the classic history by W.E.B. Dubois on Black Reconstruction. Dubois belonged to the generation of black civil rights activists born during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Southern white historians advanced the false lost cause narrative when they remembered the Reconstruction era, where the South was forced to accept the civil rights and equality for the freed black slaves and their right to vote. This was seen by these white historians as a dark and corrupt era in American history. On the other hand, Du Bois, who earned his PhD from Harvard, countered with his history of the Civil War and Reconstruction from 1860 to 1880, seeking to show that, in contrast, the years when blacks were guaranteed the civil rights and suffrage was a bright era in American history. This was an era, according to Du Bois, of democracy and great achievement. You may ask, what can we learn by pondering this history, the Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois? Although the South lost the Civil War, they won the peace. They won the cultural wars of the lost cause and white supremacy. To counter this, Du Bois describes both how the black soldiers helped win the Civil War and the many contributions blacks made during the Reconstruction era and how important they were to both of these narratives. As always, we like to select quotes from the author himself, and at the end of our talk we will discuss our sources for this video and my blogs that also cover this topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Sometimes these generate short videos of their own. Let us learn together. W.E.B. Du Bois belonged to the third generation of black civil rights leaders. To kind of place him in the generations of black leaders, we're going to say that the first generation of black leaders included Frederick Douglass, who was born in 1818 and died in 1895. He was a runaway slave, and after he escaped via the Underground Railroad to the north, he became a prominent abolitionist orator. Booker T. Washington, who was the preceding generation, was born in 1856 as a slave and died in 1915, and he was 95. Booker T. Washington, in addition to being a former slave, he was a black educator and put forth great effort to learn how to read. And he was also the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, which promoted the values of trade education for blacks. He was known for the Land of Compromise speech. And he was the generation that had to compromise to guarantee a future for his black race. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois was born in the third generation, so to speak. Born in 1868, he died in 95 and 1963, just 2 years short of the Civil Rights Act. And he was a college professor, and he was the first black to earn a PhD at Harvard. He was one of the members of the talented 10th movement of black leaders, which championed a classical liberal education for black leaders so they could help lead the civil rights activist movement. W.E.B. Du Bois was the founder of NAACP, and he was a vitriolic civil rights activist. History is most often interpreted through the lens of current events and current politics, and this is true in the history of the Reconstruction and the Civil War. The lost cause was the leading school, the Dunning School, during this period. And this started in the 1900s to the 1930s during the dark days of Jim Crow. And in those days, the Southern Democrat, President Woodrow Wilson, brought more Jim Crow hiring back into the hiring practices of the federal government. And he even screened Birth of a Nation, one of the first modern movies in the White House. And this movie sparked the resurrection of the next iteration of the KKK. The narrative of the lost cause was that the Reconstruction was a dark time in American history when the South was forced, under the threat of a gun, by the Northern armies to accept the blacks as equals and voters and citizens before they were ready for it. And much abuses occurred and much corruption occurred as a result. And this was a very dark and backward period in American history. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois viewed the Dunning School as promoting a southern white fairy tale, but more dangerously, a narrative that encouraged racial discrimination and supported white supremacy. To combat this, Du Bois published the book Black Reconstruction in 1935. Now, back in the day, Black Reconstruction earned excellent reviews from the New York Times, but it was rejected and ridiculed by the segregationist white Southern historians of the Dunning School. They thought that a black man could write a scholarly work was seen as ludicrous, and this book was ignored until the 1960s civil rights movements. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, unlike Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, he was not born a slave. He was born as a freedman in Massachusetts, and he was born after the time of the Civil War, and he attended an integrated school where the racist attitudes, they were there, but they were under the surface. I mean, like, for instance, he was rejected when he dared give a Valentine's card to a white girl. Du Bois did not experience full-throated Jim Crow KKK-style racism until he attended Fisk University in Tennessee, the Deep South. Under scholarship, he earned his PhD in Harvard, and afterwards he studied in Berlin for several years. By anybody's standards, Du Bois was a very well-educated man. The slave autobiographies, like those of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, are more personal in their descriptions of slavery because they reveal their personal miseries they suffered when they lived as a slave. And they were able to emphasize to a much greater degree how slaves were not really treated as people, but more like talking livestock who have no last names. Du Bois's opening discussion of slavery is a bit more detached, but still poignant and personal. Also, I'd like to point out that I have a blog on the Yale lectures on slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War, and the link to this blog is in the description. To understand slavery, you have to understand how central it was to the economy of the Deep South and how essential it was to Southerners themselves. In today's dollars, slaves were worth as much before the Civil War as a new economy car would be worth today. Du Bois quotes one Southerner saying that in the upper states, as much attention is paid to the breeding and growth of Negroes as to that of horses and mules. Further south, we raise them both for use and for market. Planters command their slave girls, married and unmarried, to have children. And I have known a great many Negro girls to be sold off because they did not have any children. A breeding woman is worth from 1/6 to 1/4 more than a Negro woman who does not breed. Slaves dominated America's pre-war economy. Before the war, there were like 4 million slaves, plus 500,000 black freedmen. The total value of slaves in the United States surpassed even the total value of land, and far surpassed the total value of the factories and other industries. Du Bois's theme throughout the book is the active role the black man played in both the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. Indeed, the victory of the North in the Civil War may have been impossible without the black soldiers, and many black freed slaves also played a central role in the Reconstruction era after the war, along with sympathetic Northerners who derisively called by the Southerners as carpetbaggers, and with the help of the enlightened Southerners who were also derisively called scalawags. Du Bois devotes many pages to Frederick Douglass, the runaway slave and orator, who spoke so eloquently against the evils of slavery before the Civil War. His most famous speech, his 4th of July speech, is not the typical patriotic speech that we want to listen to on July 4th. Some of the excerpts from this speech, which is a very long speech, Frederick Douglass asks, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him the gross injustice and cruelty of which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockeries. Your prayers and hymns and all your religious parades and solemnity are to him mere bombast, frauds, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, just a thin veil to cover up the crimes of slavery which would disgrace a nation of savages. Frederick Douglass continues, you boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while your whole political power is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 millions of your countrymen. You glory in your refinement in your universal education, yet you maintain a system as barbarous and dreadful as ever stained the character of a nation, a system begun in avarice, supported in pride, and perpetuated in cruelty. And Frederick Douglass continues, and he says, you hurl your anathemas at the crown-headed tyrants of Russia and Austria and pride yourselves on your democratic institutions. But in regards to the 10,000 wrongs of the American slave, you enforce the strictest silence and would hail him as an enemy of the nation who dares to make those wrongs the subject of public discourse. The subheads W.E.B. Dubois uses to set off each chapter are themselves very eloquent, like, for instance, chapter 1, which is on the black worker. W.E.B. Dubois says, how black men coming over 3 centuries became both a challenge to its democracy and always an important part of its economic history and social development. Chapter 2 is on the white worker. How America became the laborers' promised land and flocking here from all the world, the white workers competed with the black slaves and with growing exploitation. Chapter 3, he addresses to the planner. How 7% of the nation ruled 5 million white people and owned 4 million black people who sought to make agriculture equal to industry through the rule of property without yielding political power or education to labor. And I'd also like to point out, as we get into the years of the Civil War, there's also a blog on how the slaves helped the Union win the Civil War from, again, the Yale lecture series. And to summarize the main phases of the black participation in the Civil War, on April 12, 1861, the Civil War starts. There's really no policy at first. In the first months of the war, blacks start fleeing to the Union lines, and the generals don't know what to do with them. Some generals even send the runaway slaves back to their masters. But in August 1861, the Northern opinion shifts, and the U.S. Congress classifies former slaves as contraband of war, who now can work for the North, working as servants. Often they also serve as spies for the Union Army. Also, some generals have runaway slaves work as freedmen in abandoned plantations. There's some experimentations. For instance, in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, land is subdivided amongst the black freedmen, and they're able to work the plantations. In 1862, former slaves start taking arms as Union soldiers because as the war deepens, the North finds it harder and harder to find volunteers and draftees to man the Northern armies, and due to the tremendous casualties of the war. In late 1862, President Lincoln issues, under his war powers, the Emancipation Proclamation, that only slaves in rebelling areas as of January 1st, 1863 are freed. And also, at long last, May 9th, 1865, the Civil War ends, and in December of that year, 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. A southern state will not be readmitted to the Union until it adopts the 13th Amendment. Likewise, in Chapter 5, the Dubois subhead, for the coming of the Lord, he says how the Negro became free because the North could not win the Civil War if he remained in slavery. How arms in the hands of the Negro and the prospects of arms in 1 million more black hands brought peace and emancipation to America. And the Civil War drug on for many years, many more years than anybody had anticipated. As the war progressed, the bravery shown by the black soldiers in the Union Army impressed many in the North, including President Lincoln. When the war began, Lincoln said the North was fighting for the Union, but as the war dragged on, and there were so many casualties, then Lincoln said that somehow the Civil War was about slavery. And Du Bois quotes Lincoln addressing the colored soldiers in the field. Let me say, God has made you free. Although you have been deprived of your God-given rights by your so-called masters, you are now as free as I am, and if those that claim to be your superiors do not know that you are free, take the sword and bayonet and teach them that you are. For God created all men free, giving to each the same rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. After the Civil War came Reconstruction, and there's several phases of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction actually began before the Civil War ended, as it became clear that the South would lose the war. The first phase was presidential Reconstruction from 1864 to 1867. And in this phase, although Southern states were required to abolish slavery, they enacted harsh black codes which practically re-enslaved their black workers. This was followed by a reaction against this called Radical Reconstruction from 1866 to 1877. The Southern states were put under military occupation, and they were forced to grant blacks the right to vote and guarantee the civil rights, including due process. And there was still a tremendous amount of violence during this period with the KKK and the Night Riders. They were suppressed, but never totally extinguished. And the era of redemption and Jim Crow, and redemption is oddly enough a religious term, and this lasted from 1878 up to the 1960s in the passage of the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s. And these Jim Crow statutes that were enacted took away from blacks the right to vote and many of their civil rights and their rights as citizens. They were again a subclass of citizen not deserving of any rights at all. And lynchings and race riots were common in the early decades of the Redemption period. And we also have a blog on the post-Civil War Reconstruction Redemption area, also based on the Yale lecture notes. Now, Lincoln was assassinated soon after the end of the Civil War. Andrew Johnson was picked as his vice president for 1864. At that time, believe it or not, the Republicans thought they'd probably lose the election. So they were not really concerned about picking someone who was qualified to be vice president. They were wanting a compromise candidate that would be from a border state, and the border state of Tennessee. Unfortunately, although Andrew Johnson was known as being against the planter class, he was both a rabid racist and incredibly tactless, totally clueless about Northern public opinion. He even, at the end of his term in office, pardoned the Confederate soldiers and officers and plantation owners. And he returned to the plantation owners their seized plantations, even when the land had been previously given to the black freedmen and had been farmed for years. And like Lincoln, he sought to admit the southern states under very lenient terms. Speaking of this dark time in American history, the chapter 6, Looking Backward, so Dubois titles it. His subhead, How the planters, having lost the war for slavery, sought to be back again where they left off in 1860, merely substituting for the individual ownership of slaves a new state serfdom of black folk, which includes the sharecropping system, which we're not going to get into in great detail in this video. Although the North could conquer the South by force of arms, they could never change the hearts of Southerners, or their own hearts either. And WEB Dubois writes of this period, the Negro's access to the land was hindered and limited. His right to work was curtailed. His right of self-defense was taken away when his rights to bear arms was stopped. And his employment was virtually reduced to contract labor, with penal servitude as a punishment for leaving his job. And in all cases, the judges of the Negro's guilt or innocence, rights and obligations were men who believed firmly, for the most part, that the Negro had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. This is actually a quote from the Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott that's helped start the Civil War. Blacks were often killed. Du Bois quotes a former Mississippi slaveholder who said this, General Chetlain of Mississippi tells us that while he was in command on 9 counties, there was an average of 1 black man killed every day. Then in moving out 40 miles on an expedition, he found 7 Negroes wantonly butchered. Also, General Thomas of the Freedmen's Bureau tells us that on the average 2 or 3 black men are killed daily in Mississippi. And the Sable Patriot in Blue, or the black Union soldiers, as they return, are the objects of special spite. Now, Northern public opinion was outraged by the continuing hatefulness and bloodshed against the freed slaves in the southern states. And the legislators in the southern states overplayed their hands by enacting harsh black codes. The final straw, in the 1866 midterm elections, very few blacks were allowed to vote. And voted in to Congress were many former Confederate officials, as well as generals. Many newspapers and Northern voters asked the angry question, why in the world do we even fight this Civil War if we allow this to happen? And then many in the North realized that if these freed slaves counted as one person, and in contrast, slaves before the Civil War only counted as 3/5 of a person, this meant that the Southern stranglehold over American politics could actually increase. In response, the Republican-dominated Congress refused to seat the Southern Confederate congressmen who traveled to Washington, D.C. They were forced to return home, and the South, for many years, was placed under military rule under 5 military districts. However, most of the Northern soldiers had been furloughed at the end of the war, so these military districts were always undermanned. These Union soldiers enforced civil rights and guaranteed the rights of blacks to vote. And the new elections that were forced on the South, these new black voters, with many so-called scalawag Southerners who supported civil rights for the black, elected Republican state governments rather than the segregationist Democratic governments. And eventually President Johnson was impeached for obstructing radical Reconstruction and trying to veto so many of the Reconstruction Civil War acts, most of which were overridden by Congress. One bright spot was the Freedmen's Bureau. This was actually started in the latter years of the Civil War, and although it was never meant to be a permanent bureau, it was the first federal welfare agency that tried to ensure justice and fair wages for all blacks and all poor people, building many public schools and public hospitals. WEB Dubois writes, 12 labors of Hercules faced the Freedmen's Bureau to make as rapidly as possible a general survey of conditions and needs in every state and locality, to relieve immediate hunger and distress, to appoint state commissioners and upwards of 900 bureau officials, and to put laborers to work at regular wages, to transport teachers and laborers and officials, to furnish land for the peasants, the black freedmen, to open schools, to pay bounties to black soldiers and their families, to establish hospitals and guard health, to administer justice between man and former master, to answer continuous and persistent criticism from Northerner and Southerner, from black and white, and to find funds to pay for all of these responsibilities. The Freedmen's Bureau faced many challenges in ensuring that the civil rights of blacks would be respected. A congressional report quoted by Du Bois states that the Freedmen's Bureau is almost universally opposed by the mass of the population and exists in an efficient condition only under military protection, while the Union men of the South are earnest in its defense, declaring with one voice that without its protection the colored people would not be permitted to labor at fair prices and could hardly live in safety. They also testify that without the protection of the U.S. troops, Union men, whether from the North or the South, would need to abandon their homes. The feeling of many in the South towards the emancipated slaves, especially among the uneducated and ignorant, was one of vindictive and malicious hatred. This deep-seated prejudice against color is assiduously cultivated by the public journals and newspapers, and leads to acts of cruelty, oppression, and murder, which the local authorities are at no pains to prevent or punish. On the bright side, Du Bois includes this quote by Booker T. Washington on public education during this time. Few people who were not there can really understand the intense desire which the people of my race showed for education. It was a whole race trying to go to school. Few were too young and none too old to make the attempt to learn. As fast as any kind of teachers could be secured, not only were the day schools filled, but night schools as well. The great ambition of the older colored freedmen was to try to learn to read the Bible before they died. In response to the political violence of the South and to break the back of the original KKK, the Congress passed the KKK Act, which has also seen some action in the recent months as part of the reaction against the Capitol riots. The KKK Act enabled the suspension of habeas corpus in areas of rebellion where justice for black citizens proved impossible. Under the authority of this act and the Civil Rights Acts, General Grant commanded the Army to put down the original version of the KKK, which was originally suppressed or at least driven underground. Southern states could be admitted to the Union only after they passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and later the 14th and 15th Amendments. Eric Foner wrote a tremendous book on this called The Second Founding. That's going to be the object of a future blog and also a YouTube video. 13th Amendment was passed in 1865 that abolished slavery. In response to the recalcitrance of the South, the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, which states that everyone born in the United States is a citizen, and this guarantees due process and equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment in 1870, the right of citizens to vote cannot be denied on the basis of race, color, or prior servitude. You might ask, why are these three amendments passed over a period of 3 years rather than immediately after the Civil War? Well, at the end of the Civil War, Northern public opinion would only support abolishing slavery, and that was a close call as it was. But the intransigence of the South guaranteed the passage of the 14th Amendment, and in 1865, many Northern votes did not permit blacks to vote. And most Southern states, to be readmitted to the Union, had to pass all three of these Reconstruction amendments. What were some of the political accomplishments of Reconstruction? Well, the public education system was established in the South, under which many blacks were educated. Black colleges and churches survived to fight for civil rights and black suffrage. After the Reconstruction ended, yes, funding was pulled from these endeavors, but they were never completely eliminated. Former black slaves were elected as sheriffs, judges, and state legislators. And there was Republican governors in all the southern states. And many of these governments had black representatives and black state senators. And in the years from 1870 to 1887, 15 black southern representatives and 2 black southern senators were elected to Congress. And in the years from 1886 to 1929, in addition, 5 black southern representatives were elected to Congress during those years. However, Northern public opinion would hold fast only so many years against the Southern stubbornness and refusal to treat the black man as his equal. In Chapter 16, which Du Bois titles Back to Slavery, his subhead reads, "How Civil War in the South began again, and indeed had never ceased, and how the black Prometheus, bound to the Rock of Ages by hate, hurt, and humiliation, has his vitals eaten out as they grow, yet lives and fights for another day." Now, Du Bois is referring to the Greek myth of Prometheus, the immortal god who gave fire to man and was punished by Zeus. Every day an eagle eats his liver in the myth, and every night his liver grows back. The event that eventually ended Reconstruction was the Panic of 1873. This was a severe depression that lasted until 1877. Some of the causes of the panic, speculation. There was the Great Chicago Fire, the Great Boston Fire, and banks and railroads were under stress. Some went bankrupt. Factories laid off many workers, as did the railroads. This was an age where there was no social safety net at all. So there was no Northern enthusiasm during the panic to continue the paying for the military occupation of the still recalcitrant Southern states. Southern Democrats knew this was their chance to seize control. In the presidential elections of 1876, there was violent intimidation of the Negro voters. KKK and similar Night Rider gangs became more active. Many Negroes were lynched while they attempted to vote. In some counties, white terrorists seized the ballot boxes of majority black counties and destroyed them. The elections in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina were disputed. Although the Republicans clearly won the election, the Democrats claimed victory, and both parties selected dual sets of electors. The South was teetering on the edge of armed rebellion. Many feared that the Civil War would reignite over this presidential election. In response, to try and stave off further violence, Congressional Electoral Commission was formed, but in a backroom deal among the leaders of Congress, the agreement was that the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes would be elected president, and the South would benefit from the North pulling its troops from the southern state and ending Reconstruction. Immediately, the Jim Crow repression and the KKK violence came roaring back, and over the next 4 years, a reign of terror enabled the Democratic Party to wrest control over all Southern governments. Also, in succeeding years, the Supreme Court castrated the Reconstruction amendments. Du Bois quotes an eyewitness telling a Senate committee about how blacks were terrorized. Some planters held back their former slaves on their plantations by brute force. Armed bands of white men patrolled the country roads to drive back the Negroes wandering about. Dead bodies of murdered Negroes were found on and near the highways and byways. Gruesome reports came back from the hospitals. Reports of colored men and women whose ears had been cut off, whose skulls had been broken by blows, whose knives had been slashed by knives and lacerated with scourges. A veritable reign of terror prevailed in many parts of the South. Du Bois also writes, while all instruments of group control, police, courts, government appropriations were in the hand of whites, no power was left in Negro hands. If a white man is assaulted by either a white man or a Negro, the police are at hand. But if a Negro is assaulted by a white man, the police are more apt to arrest the victim than the aggressor. If a Negro is assaulted by another Negro, he is in most cases left without redress or protection whatsoever. In this period, black labor is shamefully exploited in the sharecropper system, which we're not going to get into here. Du Bois writes, the Civil War in the South, which overthrew Reconstruction, was a determined effort to reduce black labor as nearly as possible to a condition of unlimited exploitation and build a new class of capitalists on this foundation. The wage of the Negro, despite the war amendments, was to be reduced to the level of bare subsistence by taxation, peonage, caste, and every form of discrimination in open defiance of the clear letter of the law. Often this terror had the full support of the local white community. The Jim Crow system was enacted in all of its ugly provisions in violation of the original intent of the Reconstruction Amendment. First, and most importantly, barriers to prevent blacks from voting, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests. Then funding was reduced for many public schools and public hospitals. Vagrancy statutes were elected. Loitering blacks were placed in chain gangs and leased out to plantations and mines. Many blacks died in abysmal working conditions in this peonage. You might ask, how did the blacks survive the terrors of Jim Crow? Du Bois writes, had it not been for the Negro school and college, the Negro would have been driven back into slavery. His economic foothold in land and capital was too slight in these 10 years of turmoil. His Reconstruction leadership had come from Negroes educated in the North, and white politicians, capitalists, and white Northern teachers. But through establishing public schools and private colleges and by organizing the Negro Church, the Negro had acquired enough leadership and knowledge to thwart the worst designs of the new slave drivers. They avoided the mistake of trying to meet force by force. They bent to the storm of beating, lynching, and murder and kept their souls in spite of public and private insult of every description. But then as now, the brutality was not universal, and as the old white men died off, the younger generations were not quite as brutal. Now, Eric Foner observed that although the blacks lived in abject poverty, that still was a small step above slavery. The blacks were not forced to pick cotton in labor gangs on plantations under the whip of overseers. They were allowed the minimum privileges of citizenship, including the right to marry whom they chose, and their families could not be broken up like they were under slavery. So Eric Foner tells us that the dual pillars of the black family and the black church helped the blacks to survive and thrive, somewhat thrive, I suppose. In a very real sense, Reconstruction was continued through the civil rights era of the 1960s, and indeed has never really been finished. And we also have a blog on the Yale lectures on the American civil rights history through the 1960s. My main source is Black Reconstruction by WEB Dubois. And my recommendation is to read Black Reconstruction before the other fine histories of Reconstruction by Eric Foner and many others. W.E.B. Du Bois uses as his main source the congressional reports, which include riveting personal accounts of the injustices the blacks suffered through the Reconstruction period. And his accounts are more personal because as a black man, this history is very personal to him. But he's still an honest historian, and he doesn't twist history to fit his view of the truth. And he doesn't have to, because his views hew very closely to the actual truth of the history of the period. I mean, after all, slavery did cause the Civil War. The organization of his material is excellent. I actually prefer it to the histories of Eric Foner. He covers the history of Reconstruction region by region. The project of Du Bois was to show that blacks were instrumental in the civil rights successes of Reconstruction. But since these achievements were rolled back, we have not really reviewed this history in this video or in our blogs. And also, we were mainly looking for quotes and stories that bring this history to life. We also can't forget Eric Foner's masterwork on Reconstruction, this very thick work. But we want to caution you, it is very thick and not too many stories, so we didn't really use it as a source, direct source in our blog. But we do want to point out that Eric Foner does have an excellent series of videos on YouTube from Columbia University of his college lectures on the Reconstruction period. If you're going to read about Reconstruction, we instead recommend that you review some of the shorter histories that he writes about Reconstruction, like this Forever Free with Joshua Brown. Please click on the link in the description for our blog for Black Reconstruction, and please click on the links for other interesting YouTube videos to help broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.